I struggle to find the words to describe what happened not just today, but for the last 4 months. I think that it's probably an understatement to say that a session that ended the way it did is disappointing. The fact that we didn't make any significant changes to the gross production tax, we passed a variety of unconstitutional revenue measures, passed a budget that didn't offer up any real new money to education or health care or public safety. Basically, what they considered holding them flat turns out to be an effective budget cut because of the increase in population and responsibilities of those agencies. And you had a legislative group that refused to move forward on criminal justice reform in a significant way, even though there was bipartisan support for it. You put all of that together, and today sort of brought the legislative session to a close with a loud thud. And I'm relatively confident that because of the unconstitutional way in which this budget was piecemealed together, that we will be back here sometime either this summer or early fall in a special session to address the measures such as the cigarette tax and potentially a few other measures that they passed in the last 5 days, or as in the case of the cigarette tax, in the last 5 hours of session in violation of the Oklahoma State Constitution. I tried to find some highlights in the year. And I've yet to come with any major ones. I thought we would have criminal justice reform as part of it, but unfortunately, even with the governor pushing for it, she couldn't get Representative Scott Biggs to do the right thing to allow for the voice of the people to be heard on the issue of criminal justice reform. While we blame Representative Biggs for holding it up, I will say this: make no mistake about it. Representative Biggs had the power to hold up criminal justice reform for one reason, and that's because the Speaker of the House gave him those bills. He directed that legislation to his committee instead of sending it to another committee where it could have been heard and could have been brought on the floor and passed. And so some of the blame for inaction around criminal justice reform lies at the feet of the Speaker of the House as well. When it comes to what the Republicans said they wanted to do all along, they wanted to find recurring revenue. They wanted to structurally change the budget, and they failed to do that this year. Of a $900 million budget hole that eventually grew to about a $1.1 billion budget hole, they were only able to find about $300 million worth of recurring revenue, and of that, most of it comes from a car tax that may be unconstitutional because of when it was passed, and a cigarette tax that I believe is unconstitutional because of the way it was passed. So there's a very real possibility that when these things get challenged in court, the $300+ million worth of recurring revenue that they believe that they found to try to change the structural problems within our budget could all go away. And we'll be right back here this summer with the same fight over finding on how we find a way to really and truly balance the budget. So all in all, when you look back on it, with no real structural changes to how we balance the budget, with no changes on criminal justice reform, with higher ed still taking a cut, the Health Care Authority looking at 3.5% rate reductions for their providers, the Department of Transportation took a $200 million cut collectively. You could just go down the list, and it was a very disappointing session. And the most disappointing part of it all was that we had an opportunity. The public demanded additional revenue into the budget. We had an opportunity for the Republicans to stand up and do the right thing on income taxes as well as gross production tax, and including cigarette taxes. And because of the Senate Republicans refusing to take up the income tax at all, because of the governor and Republican leadership refusing to tell the oil and gas industry no, we couldn't make any movement on gross production taxes significantly. And I'm afraid we're going to be back here next year looking at anywhere between a $400 to a $600 million budget hole and trying to find a way to not find an increase in teacher salaries, which we need to do, but just find a way to patch the budget together. It's a very disappointing session, and it's disappointing because leadership allowed it to be so. State Question 640 says a revenue-raising measure has to have a 3/4 majority vote, and then it also in the same section of the Constitution says you can't pass it in the last 5 days of session. If the Supreme Court interprets what they did on the car tax and the cigarette tax as anything other than a revenue-raising measure, then I think for all intents and purposes, State Question 640 would be dead, because everybody in the building knows that the whole purpose behind this new car tax and this new cigarette tax was for the purpose of raising revenue, and they got it done. And they got it done with less than 76 votes, and they got it done in the last 5 days of session, both of which I think are violative of the Oklahoma Constitution. And I have heard rumors, and so I don't have any evidence to back them up, but I heard rumors that there was a potential that a member of the Supreme Court had been called into the Speaker's office to discuss the constitutionality of the cigarette tax, but I don't have any evidence to back that up, and so I don't know who it would have been. My hope is that it didn't happen, because I think any case that could come before the Supreme Court is so as to avoid a conflict of interest. It would be best for the court and the Speaker's office to not communicate with one another about a bill. You could ask any member of the Supreme Court today what their thoughts are on any piece of legislation coming through the process, and they will tell you that they're not allowed to opine on it until it comes before them in a brief or in a legal challenge. And so I was concerned when I heard the rumor, but I don't have any direct evidence to back it up, and so I'll leave it to intrepid reporters like yourself to find the answers. Make no mistake about it, our caucus on numerous occasions offered to restore some of the gross production tax cuts, along with restoring income tax cuts as part of a gasoline package and a cigarette tax package. And every time we offered that up, the President Pro Tem of the Senate said he wouldn't move on income taxes. When the President Pro Tem of the Senate said that when he offered us a 5% gross production tax on all new wells, our caucus, both in the House and the Senate Democratic caucuses, accepted it. And then the President Pro Tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House went back on their word and said, no, never mind, we don't want that. We only want 3% increases on all new wells, which would only bring in about $6 million. And so at the end of the day, this wasn't about Democrats or Republicans winning the battle around gross production taxes and other revenue-raising measures. This is about the public, the people of Oklahoma winning. And you had, when you have a member of the oil and gas industry calling into the negotiation surrounding the budget and gross production taxes at the request of the governor, that is all the evidence you need to prove that the oil and gas industry had an outsized influence in this process. And I make no bones about it. If the oil and gas industry was willing, if a select few major players in the oil and gas industry were willing to go to 4.5% or 5% on gross production taxes, a much larger grand bargain would have been had. But unfortunately, the oil and gas industry refused to budge, and what you saw was a gimmick gross production tax increase for about 1.5 years or so, which turns out to be just one-time money or 1.5-time money, and it all goes away in a couple of years, and we'll be right back here with a gross production tax still at 2%, still the lowest in the entire nation, especially for major oil and gas producing states, and we'll still be struggling to find a way to pay for teachers and state employees and health care. We'd heard a variety of different numbers being tossed around concerning the cigarette tax, and at one point last year it was $150 million, then it went up to $180 million, and then this year it was $215, and we even heard $257. I think what she has in her budget, and I could be wrong, but you have to ask her, I think what she's got in her budget is that the cigarette tax is anticipated to bring in about $257 million when fully annualized. I don't think she planned on the emergency clause passing, and so I think they reduced that back down to $215 million for this next fiscal year, and so that would avoid any of those problems with the emergency clause failing. And at the end of the day, though, the issue around the cigarette tax isn't the emergency clause, it's the fact that it's unconstitutional in its form and the way it was passed. When Representative Williams and Representative Proctor and Representative Goodwin and the rest of them say that we want a 5% gross production tax, make no mistake about it, that's their position, that was our caucus position, and I believe that what we did hopefully advance the dialogue on revenue-raising measures, and will put us in a situation, should we come back to a special session, where we'll finally be able to achieve the victories for the people of Oklahoma and not for me or my caucus personally. I think there's a potential that should the Supreme Court strike down the cigarette tax, I think there's a real potential that we come back to special session and renegotiate gross production taxes. I've never had more communications around a particular issue in my 11-year career than I had around the gross production tax. The only people, and I mean this, the only people who were lobbying to keep the gross production tax artificially low, like it currently is, were members of the industry and House and Senate Republicans. Everybody else, everybody that we heard from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in the district, outside the district, talking about gross production taxes, saying, stay strong, I'm a Republican, it should go back up to 7%. We got dozens and dozens of emails from people who work in the industry saying, I work for Harold Hamm, I can't say this publicly, but we think it ought to go back up to 7%. And so the overwhelming support that our caucus got was to go to 7%. And when our caucus refused to go below 5, in the sense of 5 on all new wells, we said we'd go to 4 on 12 months and 4.5 on 18 months. Understand that structure wasn't because it's where I put my caucus. It's because that's where my caucus was. The people put us there, and they firmly believe that should they have cut a deal at 4% at 36 months, which would only bring in $13 million next year, the public would have been outraged by it, because the public was demanding 7%. And when we would say, when we would talk about negotiating down to 5%, the blowback we would get from the public wasn't that it should go lower than that. It was that we shouldn't even go to 5. And so my caucus was resolved to try to get the gross production tax to 5 moving forward, to accept the deal that the pro tem had offered, because it was the right thing to do, but also because the people of Oklahoma were demanding it. They've only found about $300 million worth of recurring revenue in this budget, and about all of that comes from a constitutionally infirm cigarette tax and a car tax. And I think both of those, or one or both of those, fail. That puts us right back in the negotiating room to discuss gross production taxes. But also, when we come back next year, we're looking at between a $400 to $600 million budget hole right off the top because of the one-time revenue that has been baked into this budget. And I think we'll still be able to come back and have the discussions around that issue, getting us to the point where it ought to go to 5 or potentially up to 7%. So the people are demanding it. Just because we didn't get it this year, because the oil and gas industry outmuscled the public, doesn't mean that we can't come back next year and try to get it done then.